Have you ever heard a quote so many times that you literally just stop hearing what it's actually saying? Take this super famous passage, for example. For like 2 millennia, pulpits have completely flattened these words into a simple membership drive, basically a mandate to just believe the right things and make sure you join the right group. But the author of the document we're looking at today challenges us to ask a totally different question. What if this text isn't about joining a church at all? What if it's actually describing a radical internal architecture of human consciousness?
Welcome back to the channel. Today, I am absolutely thrilled to take you on a deep, comprehensive dive into this esoteric post-institutional framework titled The Narrow Gate on Wakefulness and the Architecture of the Two Paths. The author of this fascinating document argues that this ancient text isn't a commentary on morality, but a raw, structural map of human awareness. We're going to cover this entire source document for the channel today to unpack a paradigm shift that the author believes will completely change how you view your own daily consciousness.
So, here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to follow the author's exact 6-part architecture. First, redefining the wide path. Then how the narrow gate is remembering. Next up is why few find it, followed by destruction as simple entropy. Then a universal structural constant, and finally, the daily practice of attention.
Okay, let's jump right into Section 1, Redefining the Wide Path.
So the very first thing the author literally demands from us here is to just toss out the traditional moralistic reading. Why? Well, think about it. If you view the wide path as just a checklist of bad behaviors, lying, stealing, whatever rules a specific tradition pushes, it makes the passage kind of useless. I mean, behavior can usually be fixed with just a bit of willpower, right? Instead of moral failure, this esoteric view argues the wide path is actually just a state of autopilot. It's when your identity is completely fused to your ego, your appetites, and your fears, basically running on a story installed by the system before you could even object to it. It's wide because it requires absolutely nothing from you. You just fail to choose and the current takes you. And interestingly enough, the author points out that institutions actually prefer this current, because a population running on autopilot is incredibly easy to steer. Certainty that's just manufactured and handed down to you is still autopilot. It's just autopilot with a him attached.
And that brings us to Section 2. The narrow gate is remembering.
So if the wide path is this default state of drifting, just sustained by sheer inertia, what's the alternative? We've got to shift our focus to the intense, and I mean intense, intentionality required to find the narrow gate. The author points to this concept called anamnesis. It basically means remembering, but doing it deliberately and going completely against the grain. It's the act of turning your awareness back onto itself, rather than just letting it run outward to chase whatever your ego is currently attached to or afraid of. Finding this gate isn't about joining some mediating structure or adopting a specific set of beliefs. It's really about taking off the false self.
And where exactly does this gate lead? The text says it leads to life. But, and this is a big but, the Greek word used here is zoe. Zoe is not bios, it's not just, biological continuation, it's the deeper current of being. It aligns beautifully with the Gospel of Thomas, which suggests the kingdom is already spread out on the earth, but people simply don't see it. This means life isn't some reward you get after you die for being a good person. It is a present state of perception that you either occupy right now or you don't. Which leads us to a pretty vital question. Why is the gate narrow instead of just being difficult? I mean, if it were just hard, you could brute force your way through it, right? But a narrow gate has a specific, rigid shape. You either fit that shape or you don't. And to fit it, the false self can't just be managed or improved, it has to be completely removed. That is exactly why institutional structures so often avoid this interpretation, because a kingdom that you carry inside you, which you access by dissolving your own ego, doesn't need a middleman.
This structural reality takes us right to Section 3, Why Few Find It.
When you hear that only a few find the narrow gate, it's super easy to read that as kind of elitist, like the divine is just arbitrarily rationing out grace. But the author argues it's actually a scarcity of human willingness. They note, waking up costs something. It usually costs the story you've been told about who you are. Losing your installed identity is terrifying. Reversing direction against family systems, economic survival, and honestly just the sheer comfort of not having to ask hard questions, it requires immense effort. Almost no one sustains the kind of attention required to walk this path on, say, a random Tuesday, simply because the cost of losing their story is way too high.
This actually builds into a totally fascinating cross-cultural connection. The author, who is speaking from direct personal experience here, draws a parallel between the narrow gate in Matthew and the Eastern concept of a Kundalini awakening. In both traditions, the ascent is narrow in a very literal physical sense. It's a specific channel that can badly destabilize you if you approach it carelessly with your false self still intact.
These are two completely different vocabularies, literally 18 centuries and several continents apart, pointing to the exact same underlying mechanism of human consciousness.
Okay, let's take a quick mental breath here, because we need to pivot to the heavier side of this whole equation. If the narrow gate leads to this profound state of Zoe, what happens to the massive amount of people who stay comfortably on autopilot? Like, what does destruction actually mean in this text?
Let's unpack that in Section 4. Destruction is not a punishment, it's an entropy.
So the author views this entirely through a post-institutional lens, completely stripping away the concept of some punishing, wrathful deity administering hellfire. The Greek word translated as destruction is apoleia. And get this isn't damnation. It's just the natural dissipation, the entropy, of the unexamined ego over time. Unexamined identification with the material self simply dissolves. It never coheres into anything that outlasts the physical body. The wide path doesn't lead to a place of fiery torment. It simply leads nowhere in particular because nothing of permanence was ever built there in the first place.
So the real crucial takeaway here is this. Only Zoe has actual structural permanence. The narrow path leads to life because the Christ nature, that inner spark, what Gnostics actually call a piece of the pleroma or divine fullness, is literally the only thing that survives this entropy. And the beautiful part is it was never actually lost to begin with. It was only forgotten in the mindless autopilot of the wide path.
And that leads us perfectly into Section 5, a universal structural constant.
You see, Matthew didn't just invent this binary shape of human existence, he was tapping into a profound observation that spans human history. We see this convergence absolutely everywhere. Matthew has the narrow versus wide gate, but then Deuteronomy sets life and blessing against death and the curse. The Qumran community, they describe the spirit of light versus the spirit of darkness. The Didache literally opens with the two ways catechism. This isn't evidence of one ancient tradition just cleverly copying another. It proves that the pull toward unconscious drift and the narrow discipline required to resist it is a structural constant of the human condition. It's been independently rediscovered across time. And in this esoteric territory, convergence like this is the closest thing to proof we get.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 6, the daily practice of attention.
So how do we actually live this out? Well, once you strip away the institutional demand to just join the right church, this text becomes an incredibly practical philosophy for everyday living. The narrow gate isn't some one-time initiation, it requires an hour-by-hour choice. You literally have to deliberately choose attention over autopilot, constantly catching yourself when you've drifted back onto the wide path, because trust me, you will drift. The author shares a really fascinating personal insight here too. They view their own ADHD not as a deficit, but as a strange asset. The friction that makes conventional paths so difficult for an ADHD mind is the exact same friction that makes it harder to stay comfortably numb on the wide path. A mind that refuses to stay grooved in a default pattern has a shorter distance to travel back to the narrow gate. Ultimately, walking this path means sustaining your attention well past the point where it stops being interesting and starts just being hard work.
The ultimate conclusion of this whole document is honestly profound. The narrow gate is, quote, not a locked door, an open one that almost nobody bothers to keep walking toward. It's not fenced off by some deity holding back grace. It's simply waiting there for anyone willing to sustain the attention required to reach it.
So I want to leave you with this. Take a hard look at your own life, your own daily consciousness. Are you actively walking toward the narrow gate right now, choosing intentionality and awareness? Or are you just comfortably coasting on autopilot, letting the current of the wide path decide your destination for you? The door is wide open. The choice of attention is entirely yours.